If you're an AC/DC fan, I think you will enjoy this video that I have for you today. I found this old newspaper article from the Columbia Daily Tribune, Thursday, October 9th, 1980. And I think this article actually it wasn't just in one newspaper. I think this was one of those things that was sent out through the press and it was published in a lot of different newspapers. But I read this and I thought it was kind of interesting, especially AC/DC is such an interesting study because they were becoming so famous. And then all of a sudden, of course, Bon Scott dies. And then Brian Johnson kind of comes in almost out of nowhere and takes the reins as the singer of the band. And they were already becoming famous. And then Brian Johnson steps in and they just superstardom. And it was just such an interesting thing because so often when you lose that front man, because Bon Scott was such an original and he was so interesting and his voice was so fascinating, to lose him and then to be able to not only not disappear, but to actually get bigger. It's such an interesting story. And so I found this article, and the reason I like this so much is this was the year that Back in Black came out. And this was not long after Bon Scott passes away, and then watching them kind of just take the reins from there and just get bigger and bigger. And so I wanted to read this to you. It's an article. It's kind of lengthy, but if you like AC/DC, you'll actually enjoy listening to this little snapshot in time from 1980. And the article, at least in this version of the newspaper, is called AC/DC Angus Young Moons Away. Milwaukee, there's a full moon out, and it belongs to Angus Young, the 21-year-old guitarist for Australian jock rockers AC/DC. While his older brother and rhythm guitarist Malcolm Young, bassist Cliff Williams, and drummer Phil Rudd hammer away on a locomotive number called Bad Bog Boogie for 6,100 raving fans in the Milwaukee Auditorium. The diminutive Young, dressed up in a green velvet school uniform complete with blazer, shorts, and beanie, puts his guitar down after an ear-raising solo and starts his nightly striptease. Hey, hold on for just a second. We'll get right back to the video. But if you like this stuff, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave any comments. We'd love to hear from you, and we really, really appreciate it. Anyway, with that, back to the video. Of course, he's famous if you're an AC/DC fan, and even if you're not, you know the look. You know, Angus Young's famous for wearing that little schoolboy outfit with the cap. And he still does. I mean, what is the guy now? 70 some odd years old. And you see shots of him live and he's got white hair now, but he still wears that schoolboy outfit. Kind of became his thing. And then, of course, during the show, he takes his shirt off and then moons the audience. Just kind of his thing. Okay. The jacket goes first, then the striped tie, and finally a white shirt soaked through with perspiration. Young struts like a rooster across the stage. The crowd screams with delight. Yeah, he has that Johnny Be Good thing that he does, where the little rooster thing that was made famous back. What do you call it? The way he does his little strut from back in the early kind of 50s days. Anyway, he kind of does. He's Angus Young carries that show. If you go back into the early days watching the stuff that he does with Bon Scott, and it's funny because Angus Young really is out front on the stage kind of carrying the show, and Bon Scott in some ways isn't the showman. It's Angus Young that really is the showman on that stage. Anyway, I didn't mean to but anyway, he does that kind of, I said Johnny Be Good, Chuck Berry. He does that kind of Chuck Berry duck walk. He has his own variation of what Chuck Berry used to do back in the 50s, Angus Young does, and he just kind of, anyway, just so much fun to watch. Let's see, white shirt soaked through with perspiration. Young struts like a rooster across the stage. The crowd screams with delight as if to say, yes, we want it all off. So Young turns his back to the crowd, bends over and drops his drawers a split second of bared bottom later. Young grabs his guitar and is off on another wild solo. The teenage mob pressed against the stage roars its approval, and that's only 3 songs into the show. They have this intense loyalty, singer Brian Johnson muses the next day. The kids don't want to just come, they want to be part of it. And that's, again, notice the time here. This is 1980. Brian Johnson making that comment has been in the band, this is October, been in the band for 8 months at this point, something like that. I mean, Bon Scott died, in February? I think they might even talk about it in this article. Within a couple of weeks, they've got Brian Johnson in the band, and they're in, Bermuda or something like that, where the Bahamas somewhere, recording Back in Black, which then catapults them to superstardom beyond where they were. A stocky, friendly bear of an Englishman, Johnson joined AC/DC last April. Okay, after the accidental death in London, February 19th, of original vocalist Bon Scott. Scott, 33, died of asphyxiation, choking on vomit after an all-night drinking binge, not of alcoholic poisoning, as originally reported. Johnson is genuinely impressed by AC/DC's drawing power, as well as the top 20 sales of Back in Black, the band's 6th Atlantic album. And that's an interesting thing, because even though Brian Johnson stepped into this band that was already huge around the world, it wasn't as though Brian Johnson was new to the world of singing. I mean, he'd been in that band Geordie for a while. That band had done okay. I mean, he hadn't done well enough that he was making a living from it, but they'd been on TV. They'd had some recordings, and so Brian Johnson was a known entity in some ways. Although, again, I think when they picked him up when AC/DC auditioned him, and he became part of the band, I think he was working in a auto shop or something like that. So he wasn't doing well, but he knew how to be in front of a crowd. He had some experience. Most interviewers do not share his or the fans' enthusiasm. From the time the Glasgow-born Young brothers formed AC/DC, the group has been slagged mercilessly as heavy metal morons. In spite of the bad reviews, a punishing tour schedule, and Scott's untimely death, AC/DC continuously has refused to give up, and Back in Black is the just reward. With the title and all-black cover meant as a tribute to Scott, the album entered the English charts at number 1 and is a safe bet to match the platinum sales in America of last year's Highway to Hell. So Highway to Hell, which may be the greatest rock and roll song of all time, was done a year earlier with Bon Scott, of course. That was his pinnacle. And that song is so, so great. And then again, as I said earlier, what's so fascinating about this then is here we are a year later, they put out Back in Black. And I was on a radio show, I don't know, here in town a year or so back. I get around a little bit, and because I have a huge record collection, people kind of know me in some ways as I don't know that I'm a rock historian, but a little bit. They had me on to talk about the resurgence of records and the history of rock and roll and that kind of thing. And it was interesting because the guy, when he was doing the interview, he looked over at me at the end of the interview. He says, "What's the greatest album of all time?" And it took me that long to answer the question. And it is Back in Black. In my opinion, the greatest rock album of all time, period, the end. Nothing even comes close. In my humble opinion, is Back in Black. It is great from every single song on there is spectacular, and so many songs that just changed everything. I mean, Hell's Bells, one of the greatest opening riffs of all time on a record. The song Back in Black itself, You Shook Me All Night Long, and Brian Johnson was never that good ever, before or after. And you read articles about him where he talks about this, that when he was recording that album, he felt a little bit out of place, because here he was with this band that everybody loved, especially coming off of Highway to Hell. And then he goes in there and he's he's feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome. Like, who am I and why am I here doing this? And he delivered one of the greatest vocal performances of any album ever, the end, period. And every song on that album was just top shelf, greatest stuff ever recorded. Anyway, so Back in Black is the just reward with the title and all black cover, blah, 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 the album entered English charts at number 1, is safe to match the platinum sales. The band's snowballing success can be attributed in part to the heavy metal renaissance sweeping both countries, but compared to the boorish macho plodding of most heavy metal heathens, the AC/DC sound is nothing more and nothing less than aggressively catchy song hooks brutalized by revved up boogie rhythm. And this is something that I think is misunderstood a little bit about AC/DC too, because they talk about it as being a heavy metal band, and I think we often think of them that way, but it's really just basic rock and roll, basic rock riffs, blues riffs. And Angus Young is not some sort of flashy guitar player. He's a blues rocker. And I remember I was a professional musician, and I used to play with people, and we would play some AC/DC songs sometimes, and they would crank up the distortion on the guitar, and I'd say, go back and listen to Angus Young's playing. There's not a lot of crunch or distortion on his guitar. The distortion that comes through with Angus Young's playing is largely just the amp overdriving. It is just that really classic kind of crunchy rock and roll Gibson sound. It isn't overly distorted. It isn't heavy metal as we know it. It's nothing like the heavy distortion that you would get with a Motley Crue or I don't know if Iron Maiden's a good example, but Metallica and Megadeth. It isn't like that. This is just crunchy Gibson SG, Marshall, just rock. Okay. And that's the point here. The music that they wrote was just catchy rock and roll. And it's part of the reason I think that they have such mass appeal. AC/DC isn't, where so many other bands, like I just said a second ago, like an Iron Maiden, like a Megadeth, they have these very specific groups of specific audiences. AC/DC is not like that. They can pull into town and fill up a stadium of every type of person, because people that like country music will like AC/DC. People who like heavy metal music will like AC/DC. People who like pop music will like AC/DC, because there's something in there for everybody, because it's so kind of this universal rock and roll sound that everybody can relate to. Anyway, all right, so let's see, brutalized is catchy song hooks brutalized by revved up boogie rhythm. Malcolm Young's jackhammer riffing, Angus Young's guitar histrionics, and Johnson's blood-curdling bawl. We just get out there and rock, says the younger Young, who loses an average of 3.5 pounds a night through his manic stage routine. If your amp blows up or your guitar packs it in, smash it up and pick up another one. We can't even stop and tune up. Those kids are all, moving up to the next, wound up. Okay. In high contrast to AC/DC's reputation as troublemakers, boozers, and womanizers, Young is a quiet, reflective sort with a crooked smile, an attractive Dutch-born wife, Ellen, and an addition to cups of hot tea with milk. Similarly, Malcolm Young does not look half so mean pushing a baby stroller carrying his 4-month-old daughter as he does banging out monster riff to Hell's Bells on a wide-body Gretsch White Falcon guitar that's almost as big as he is. And it's funny thinking about that. I mean, both these guys, the two Young brothers, of course, Malcolm's not with us anymore, but I think they're both like 5'3" or 5'4". They're just these little guys. But they just had that. They just understood rock riffs, blues riffs. They just knew how to do it. They were awesome. And that Gretsch White Falcon guitar, I think that's the one that you always see him with that's missing the pickup that Malcolm used to play. They were just awesome. Okay, in 1973, the brothers decided to join forces. From the very beginning, the band was called AC/DC, and Young's gonzo stage act was part of the show. The original singer was given notice after 2 months when they discovered Bon Scott. And I don't remember the original singer's name. I should. But a lot of people may not even realize that AC/DC had a singer before Bon Scott. But he was, Bon Scott, and he was just kind of a rough around the edges. And Bon Scott had been a background singer for, who was he? He was with somebody, but he was, again, he'd been around singing for a while, but really hadn't done much. And then AC/DC picked him up and he just found his niche. And boy, when Bon Scott, that voice, that whiny, whatever the sound that he had was just so perfect for that stuff. He was just amazing. And you watch that old footage of him on stage. And even with Angus Young kind of leading the charge of the craziness of the show and getting all the young guys riled up, Bon Scott had this interesting presence. He would usually be shirtless too, and he'd have be holding that microphone, and the way he'd stand, it was just so cool. I love these guys. Okay, anyway, let's see. The original singer was given notice. Bon Scott, native Scotsman, who was hired originally as the band's driver. 13 years young senior. A lot of people may not realize that Bon Scott was a lot older than these guys. And I think when he first joined the band, he might have even been homeless, missing a tooth, and then as they started making money, he started cleaning up and looking a little more normal. Let's see, 13 years, Scott sang with a lecherous growl that sounded like Tom Waits at 78 RPMs and was the spitting image of the songs he sang. AC/DC's first English tour in 1976 was billed as the Lock Up Your Daughters tour in honor of Scott's animal sexuality. Young admits being deeply affected by Scott's death. And that there's some, I don't know if the word scandal behind that, but not about the death itself, because he choked on his vomit. That's partly where they got the joke in the Spinal Tap thing, where they talked about a guy choking on his vomit. But the fact that he died and within weeks they were back in the studio and the band was back together, it took no time, almost like they didn't even notice that they didn't miss him. Anyway, so there was a little bit of, that was a little weird. Anyway, whatever. They put out one of the greatest albums, if not, in my opinion, the greatest album ever. Young admits being deeply affected by Scott's death. I was sad for Bon. I didn't even think about the band. We'd been with Bon all that time. We'd seen more of him than his family did. Malcolm Young adds that the thought of quitting never crossed his mind. I thought, well, F this. I'm not going to sit around moping all effing year. So I just rang up Angus and said, do you want to come back and rehearse? This was about 2 days afterwards. And I'm sure, Young continues, if it had been one of us, Bon would have done the same thing. And again, that was part of why this was such an interesting thing, because it, in the grand scheme of things, it was so fast. I mean, he died in February, and I think they had the band back together recording, what was it, by April? So he died in February. Brian Johnson, they were auditioning people within weeks to keep going on. Where so many other groups, you lose a key member like that and it's over. Or you just quit, or the band can't succeed, can't move on. These guys, no time. They're auditioning. Brian Johnson's in the band. They're recording this next album, new album's out, and then Back in Black. And then boom, never look back. And where Bon Scott they had so many great albums over and over. I just don't know, even though Back in Black, in my opinion, greatest album ever made. For Those About to Rock, which came out the next, year or so later, that was one of the greatest songs ever recorded, For Those About to Rock. But the rest of the album was, didn't live up to Back in Black. I don't know how you could. And then, in my humble opinion, even though I'm a big AC/DC fan, they just never, just nothing they did after that really measured up. It was like they just kind of lost it after that. As far as new material, they could they could ride around for the rest of their lives playing Black Sabbath, or not Black, Back in Black, and I'd be thrilled because it was such a great album. And then the early Bon Scott stuff was so spectacular. Anyway, so I thought if you're an AC/DC fan, I thought you'd get a kick out of that. Hey, before we go away, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with other people. If you know AC/DC fans, there's probably some other people who would get a kick out of this. And share it on Facebook or other places where you have friends probably that would be interested in this kind of thing.